Welcome to this video on principles behind rota design. One of the key questions our consultants are often asked when we work with clients is, how do we create the optimal rota for this area? In this video, I'm going to take you through the process we use when putting together rota options and discuss many of the key trade-offs that occur during rota design. But first of all, there is a key element to think of. What is optimal? The concept of optimal rota typically stems from the desire to generate and arrange shifts in a way that creates the best match between resources available and the demand profile. It follows the logic that if having our resources available and working at the times when work needs to be done should lead to higher levels of performance. To do this, we're going to talk about creating a good match to demand. So let's start off by understanding how we do that. Here we've got a typical demand profile for police response. On this diagram, what we see is a profile, the red line, which fluctuates across the hours of the week. We see low levels of demand overnight, peaks in the early evening, and sustained increases on Friday and Saturday evenings. So this will be consistent with the nighttime economy, where generally there's more work to be done. So that would be the demand profile in terms of what is required for resource. When we look at putting that together with the shift pattern, we create a different diagram. So in this diagram we can see the blue line here, which is the proportion of resource available. It tends to be lower than the requirement, lower than the red line throughout the day, but it increases during the shift overlap and overnights on Saturdays and Sundays. In this case, the rota provides a 59% match to demand. So not a particularly good match, where it's overstaffed overnights, but possibly doesn't have sufficient staff available throughout the day. So at Process Evolution, we use the Zyme software package that helps generate a good match to demand and gives options around optimization. So what we're going to move on to now is how well we can generate a good match to demand, and what are some of the key considerations that need to be made when trying to apply rota principles. So here we've got the typical building blocks. We talk about profiles, teams, and rota assessments. These are the typical building blocks that we would look at when assessing a rota and putting together a set of shifts for an organisation. I'm going to take each of these in turn and start to discuss why they are important and what impact they will have on the ability to create the optimal rota. So starting with match to demand. Generally, this is critical, as we said at the beginning of this video. Having your resources available at the time they're required very much gives a better chance to getting good performance. Shift start and end times. As a part of an employee contracts, most organisations have rules in place as to the minimum and maximum length of shifts that their staff can work. Generally, these will stipulate full-time shifts must be at least 7 hours. Sensible as it means that staff don't have to work very short shifts. Some organisations will also limit the length of shift, so have a maximum shift length. For example, some police forces have moved away from 12-hour shifts because of the belief that there's increased fatigue while on shift. We also see questions around start shift time. So in some organisations, there is the concept of a 7 a.m. forced start day, and they have agreements that no shifts should start prior to this time. So it'll all depend on the local agreements you have within your organisation, but concepts of shift start, end times, and the length of shifts will impact the possible solutions that you may have. There's also the idea of minimum staffing levels. So in many organisations that work 24/7, there's need to provide some level of resiliency to deal with unanticipated demand. For example, many police forces would have the requirement to have minimum staffing levels in their force control room to make sure that all the dispatch desks are covered. That consideration must be taken into account when building rotas. Also, we do see when we're working with clients, there will be specific agreements that have been made within the organisation that need to be accounted for within the constraints we're applying. Team working. So most forces we work with will see the benefit of working in teams. So the academic literature around human behaviour provides evidence that employees who work as part of a functioning team achieve higher levels of motivation and performance. So generally within emergency services, staff are split into either 4 or 5 team patterns, with each team member reporting to a single supervisor. The choice of a 4 or a 5 team structure has significant bearing on the types of shifts that employees work, and there's strengths and weaknesses to each approach. In terms of supervision, certainly there will be elements of supervisory ratios that may be at play. They may need to be considered, and typically we'd also want to have some sort of training requirement. So most organisations have determined that there's need to schedule in periodic training within the rotas for employees. These hours tend to come from the main rota, so therefore limit the time available for the employee to do their core tasks. The frequency of training days tends to depend on the industry and the rota structure, but range from say every 5 to every 15 weeks. So making a rota from shifts. Once the shifts have been decided, there are various options about how we put together a workable rota. These considerations will not impact the match to demand, but have a bearing on the work-life balance of employees. It's important to recognise there is a difference between generating a set of shifts that is legal compared with structuring a rota that meets the needs of organisations and staff groups. For example, we start to look at things like rest day rules. Generally, forces will have thoughts on the number of consecutive working days that someone would work. This can be set at 6, but in some cases may go up to 7 depending on the addition of training days. What we try to do when we put together our rotas is avoid single rest days and try to develop rotas that have blocks of time off. Now, single rest days, there's sort of 2 reasons for that. One, it allows the employee to have time off, recover, and also for work-life balance issues. There's also a concept of blocking versus forward rotation. So this is very much around how the shifts are structured. So that in the blocking principle, we generally have employees doing the same type of shifts for a block. So for example, in this example here, we've got 5 or 6 days of day shifts. Whereas in the forward rotation principle, shifts would change as staff progress through the block of rota. So they might do 2 early shifts, 2 day shifts, 2 late shifts. In terms of the difference between the two, it really depends on the employee groups. So there are strengths and weaknesses. The blocking principle gives more consistent set of start times. So for people who like to set their alarms at a specific time, then that makes sense. Whereas the forward rotation generally gives a lower fatigue score. There tends to be longer periods between ending one shift and the start of the next shift, and that allows the employee to recover during the blocks of shifts. Antisocial payments, so different rota configurations may trigger different allowances. And this can be important for HR and finance to understand. So even though as an organisation you have the same shifts, that might actually come out with a different cost based on antisocial payment agreements that you have with your employee groups. Fatigue index, so fatigue is something I mentioned earlier, but putting the shift pattern into the health and safety executive calculator to understand at what points staff would experience the highest level of fatigue and actually where this could potentially be an issue. So typically we'd see highest levels of fatigue when you work sort of 5 or 6 nights in a row, 5 or 6 shifts in a row. So by the time you get to the 5th or 6th shift, the the score would be highest, and typically you see higher risks and fatigue scores overnight. So if you had an employee who was working a block of 5 or 6 nights, then on the fifth or sixth night, you would see the highest fatigue score. So staff engagement throughout this process is important. It's important to understand the wishes of staff groups and what makes a good rota for them. In our experience of process evolution, we've seen lots of rotas that we would look at and consider non-optimal. However, some staff groups like it because of certain characteristics that makes a good rota for them. There's certainly evidence to show that rotas that don't take into consideration levels of fatigue or staff wishes can lead to higher levels of abstraction through increased sickness levels. As such, it's important to construct rotas that meet the needs of the organisation as well as the individual staff members and staff groups. What we tend to do during projects is conduct a qualitative assessment of shift patterns. So not just putting together one view, this is what the rota should look like, but actually assessing 3 or 4 options. For example, we're looking at a contact management project, and we've tried to put together a qualitative assessment of the shift patterns. So we had 4 different options, A, B, C, D, and then looking at some of the key characteristics that would be associated with each of the rota types. And this ranges from shift length, the number of rest days that an employee would receive, the match to demand, the time spent working as a team, the performance that this would generate using our call profiler models, number of supervisors required, the maximum and average fatigue levels, how often training is done, so the frequency of training, as well as the perception from staff, so understanding how the staff would feel about these rotas. Being able to colour code these and have a view allows a little bit of assessment to be done as to how the various characteristics of rotas work. So this article has highlighted some of the considerations that process evolution consultants use when we're looking to create a shift pattern for an area. For more information about our approach or Zyme software, please get in touch with us on info@processevolution.co.uk. Thank you very much.